Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Corelight Cloud Security webinar. My name is Sarah Schumann, Senior Product Marketing Manager here at Corelight. Joining me today is Vijit Nair, Senior Product Management Director, and Heath Mullins, Senior Analyst with Forrester. Now, let's go ahead. We have a lot to discuss today, so let's pop right into it. Heath, let's go ahead and start with you. Zero trust. What are the components of a zero trust model for the cloud?
You know, that is a question that comes up in inquiry a lot more than I really thought it would. When you're really thinking about it, you know, this kind of covers a very broad area and a very broad topic discussion area. With regards to what are the components of, well, you know, you still need analytics and visibility in the cloud. You probably have some sort of a, you know, control mechanism to get to those cloud properties via, you know, on-prem hybrid or some other methodology. But the reality is that if you don't understand what's happening in your cloud or your multi-cloud instance or your multi-tenant cloud instance, you're really lacking a clear understanding of what's happening, not only with your data, but what your users are doing and what's being invested into your cloud property or exfiltrated from your cloud property. So it's pretty important to remember that when you're discussing zero trust in the cloud, it's really it's the same holistic view. The technology doesn't change. It's where the technology resides. It may not reside on premise in some instances, and it may reside completely in cloud or in some other fashion all the way across there.
Yeah, and hey everybody, I'm Vijit, product management at Corelight. Yeah, I mean a lot of people start thinking of zero trust as a product, right? And I think that's probably like one of the biggest sort of misconceptions out there is that zero trust is a product or a thing that you go purchase from a vendor and you can deploy in your environment and you get zero trust. And it's really more a philosophy, right? Or like a way of thinking. The traditional way of thinking was you have perimeter, you have a fence around your house, and you lock the doors and windows and nothing can get in. You can trust everything that is inside your environment. And zero trust really kind of flips that model on its head and says you can't trust anything, right? Zero trust really means you cannot trust any entity, even if it is inside your perimeter. So you'll see a lot of sort of models out there, like Heath was referring to. You know, you'll have things sort of aligned around identity becomes a pretty important component, because not only users, but you know, services and workloads, and all of them have some notion of identity and what they are allowed to touch versus not, what they're allowed to read and modify versus not. You'll have some notions of devices and networks and subnets and so on that these devices are allowed to access. You'll have some notion of what kind of workloads and services that they can get to. And obviously, all of it is kind of tuned around protecting data, right? And like you can have various kinds of data, you know, different levels of criticality and so on that you're trying to protect. But zero trust really kind of encompasses all of this and puts sort of a philosophy around how you might think about securing your entire organization without trusting any one element. And even more importantly, not even trusting the one zero trust provider, right? Like Heath, you and I were talking about this earlier when we were chatting.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I actually had a client of mine approach me and say, we have a SASE product, we have a platform, we are zero trust. And I had to explain in very clear and reasonable means about why that was inaccurate. You know, it's sometimes the vendor environment gets away. No offense, Vijit, obviously, but sometimes it gets ahead of itself and really tries to redefine what it is to fit within a certain modality. And just, you know, being aware of, you know, regardless of where your data is, where your things are, it's still the same paradigm that you're trying to aspire to. You know, it's not an end state; it's a continuous iteration of security. It's defense in depth. If you want to go back, you know, 15 years and talk about what security was, it was defense in depth. It's right. Kind of the same paradigm, just a different perimeter.
Right. And in some ways, this is a pattern that like the sophisticated defenders are used to, right? This is what they've been doing for a long time already. They may not have been calling it zero trust, but the notion of, you know, maintaining least privileged access to your users and workloads has been kind of embedded into the community for a long time. But not only that, right? Like also having sort of continuous monitoring and visibility so that you're constantly checking whether all your policies that you put in place are actually the policies that you need and nothing is being violated and so on. So the Zero Trust framework in some sense is sort of just codifying sort of some of the best practices that a lot of the sophisticated defenders have had in place in their environment for a long time. In this day and age, with some of the newer products and newer vendors out there, there are better, better products and better approaches to achieving that today than there used to be sort of several years ago.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that you had kind of mentioned, the continuous monitoring and threat detection. Not that we have a slide up or anything like that, but the general idea, is a lot of people forget about when you're talking about, zero trust or any specific technology. GRC, governance, risk, and compliance, is paramount for zero trust in and of itself. So, what are you being held to? What are your standards being held to? How are you defining risk across your data, your agency, your organization? And what do you have to comply with? What are the absolute things? Am I a highly regulated industry? Am I the federal government? Am I financial? All these things matter when you're having these conversations, both internally and externally with the vendor community, to really ascertain, what's most important to me and what do I have to protect, because there's ramifications. It may not just be reputational damage. It may be some, you may be facing some very real threats just from, financial penalties, things like that. It's really interesting how this spans across all industries, but at the same time, you're looking at it and going, oh, well, it sounds easy. When you look at it on paper, it looks pretty easy, but the reality is, really kind of implementing these things can have a heavy lift, or it may not. This space, the NAV NDR space, is a very mature space. Technology has been around for a long time, so it really starts to talk about, how am I going to provide additional context? How am I going to get additional information to really understand what these threats are and what they're having to do on my network, or what user it's tied to? It's a really interesting paradigm these days.
Yeah.
Perfect transition to our next slide here. So
okay.
With zero trust, why is continuous monitoring and threat detection still so important? So I think Keith, you had a fantastic point there for the different industries that we're facing. Vijay, anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about a lot of zero trust sort of frameworks and policies out there, right? Like some of the stuff that we talked about, make sure that only certain users or entities have access to certain workloads and services, and kind of, create the right boundaries and all of that. If you think about it in some ways, right, this is really, a lot of this is prevention tech, right? This is make sure that you have the right policies and the right doors and so on in place to make, to keep the, any malicious actor or unintentionally sort of bad actor out of sort of critical stuff. But ultimately, this is still prevention technology. The thing that no matter what policies you have in place, it still does not obviate the need for you being able to watch your environment on a continuous basis to make sure that nothing untoward is happening, right? And this is something that is, and we've seen this kind of pendulum swing back and forth in the industry over time, right? A lot of new technologies start with a huge focus on prevention first, but as defenders get more sophisticated and attackers get more sophisticated, the pendulum swings to, all right, we really need to focus on continuous monitoring as well. So if you see some of the publications coming out of, be it CISA or NSA, right? NSA has a really good zero trust security model where they call out one of the key tenets for achieving a zero trust security model is being able to inspect and log all activity and all traffic in your environment before acting, right? Because that is really crucial to understanding what exactly is happening in your environment. And there are some use cases I can talk to as well, which, despite all the zero trust policies in place, when attacks like, an insider threat like attack happens, Or, we've seen, we've heard of some, not reports necessarily, but some vulnerabilities disclosed in, significant cloud providers, which is a cross-account takeover, right? So you're a tenant, right, running, you're happy, you're doing your thing, you have all your right policies in place, and a tenant next to you that has sort of no relationship with you and no access to your environment other than they're running on the same cloud provider infrastructure. If they can cross that infrastructure and get access to your environment, no matter what policy you have in place, right? It is impossible to prevent that kind of attack. So for those kind of scenarios, you need to have continuous monitoring in place all the time, continuous monitoring and continuous threat detection.
That's right. And I won't say it's ever fallen out of vogue because I don't think it has. However, it's fallen off of some people's radar. Realistically, here's the same thing that's been there. We're getting log files. This is great. We're transporting off to a SIM. We can see everything, but it's really not providing the full contextual picture without taking in all this other telemetry data, and all that data adds up over time. And the common argument is I have an IDS IPS. Why would I need that? Well, that's seeing north-south traffic. What are you doing about the east-west? That's where the exfiltration is happening. That's where the escalation of privileges is happening. Mm-hmm. That's where I'm making RDP traffic that is exfiltrating data look normal for all intents and purposes because I don't want to get caught. I'm being very slick about this. And those guys out there are really, really smart. For every advance in technology, there's a step ahead or a step behind. It's a dance, all throughout security. Always has been, always will be.
Right.
So let's double click on that. How does threat detection work in the cloud? Vijay, if you can start us off, what are some of the key sources of data and where do the visibility gaps lie?
Yeah, and this is the when you start thinking about zero trust and zero trust in the cloud, right? The cloud environment can get exceedingly complex, and the good part about the cloud, and one of my SEs loves to say this, the good thing about a cloud environment is that there's a lot of telemetry and a lot of data. The bad thing about a cloud environment is there's a lot of telemetry and there's a lot of data, right? There's a lot of sources of data that you have to constantly be consuming and digesting and monitoring. Some of the challenges with these different kind of sources of data, the biggest challenge with some of this kind of sources of data is that the volume of stuff coming out of cloud environments is extremely high, right? So if you think about, activity log, if you think about it from a network perspective, right, you have flow logs, firewall logs, DNS logs, and so on, like a whole kind of plethora of logs coming from just from a network point of view. Then you have a whole range of stuff coming from an activity point of view, like be it CloudTrail or some other activity or API kind of logs, as object store access logs, load balancer logs, and so on. And if you have workloads running, you have any workload agent that you have running on them generating detections and logs as well. So now you're just faced with this sort of avalanche of logs that you can barely consume in your SIM, let alone kind of digest it and make sense of it, right? So that's one problem, just the sheer volume of all these logs that you need to have turned on all the time. The other challenge is most of these logs are not designed for a security purpose, right? So if you think about these, most of these logs are designed for application monitoring to make sure, is my service, doing what it's supposed to be doing? Does it have the right access? Are the right errors being logged? That's what it's designed for. It's not designed to tell you kind of a consolidated story of this is what a user or an entity is doing in your environment over the last several minutes, right? Like that kind of story is not consolidated in those logs. So the lack of security-centric logs becomes the other big challenge. The combination of this, what happens is defenders are now forced to consume this crazy volume of logs in their SIMs, and then do a whole bunch of pre-processing of the log before they consume it into SIM, a whole bunch of enrichment on top of that, a whole bunch of post-processing and analytics to actually make sense of all this data to figure out, is there something bad going on? Is there a policy violation going on in my environment? So that becomes one of the biggest challenges that cloud SOC teams are faced with in this environment.
Wow, you said a lot of great stuff. You didn't really leave me with much to say here. I will reiterate that point about the, bringing in the telemetry from everywhere and providing not only just the raw data. Raw data is great, right? Unless you're the one that has to go through it. So applying, the concepts of AI and ML and really getting in there and sorting through that data and parsing it and providing the additional context for every event that happened on the network, and whether that's cloud, multi-cloud, hybrid, on-prem, whatever that thing looks like, that context right there is what is allowing the SOC operators to have a clear understanding of what is happening right now and what that timeline looked like going back in time. Now, if that's going back a day, you're doing great. Is it going back 3 months? Does that mean you did wrong? No, it just means that somebody was really good at their job and they went and sat. They didn't just land and exploit. That's how you get caught. So these days, they're just hanging out and saying, you know what, I'm going to leave this alone for 6 months. If I don't get discovered, I'm going to start moving. And then perhaps something will be caught, depending upon how they go about it. That's great points, man. Wow.
Yeah, no, that's actually, and clearly, I have not thought about this at all. But actually, that's a really good point. That if you think about, most folks think about security-centric data in terms of detections, right? When something bad happens in my mind, I need a detection, I need an alert to be able to find it right away. But if you think about really sophisticated, really advanced APT-style attackers, they are, usually smart enough to evade most of the detections that you have. And B, they're also smart enough to be in your environment long enough before they actually sort of execute on their objectives and exfil data and so on, right? So typically when that kind of thing happens, you're really looking back, a week, a month, 3 months, in case of SolarWinds, probably like 9 months and beyond, when that first intrusion happened. And if you don't have that kind of data to be able to go back and look at it, right, you're really kind of dead in the water. And the other piece is you really still need that raw data, right? Like if you want to go back 9 months and look at, what was that first point, the first entry point for this attacker to get in my environment. If you don't have that raw data to be able to figure out, to be able to go back and actually query it, again, you're kind of dead in the water, right? You don't know where they got in, what their collateral damage was, and so on.
Yeah, that retrospective analysis is so huge. It's great to understand that something happened. One of the things that my clients frequently have discussions around is how long do we retain data? Well, the answer is how long do you need to retain data? Are you being bound by something to retain for a certain amount of time? And then if you do have this data, how can I perform retrospective analysis? It may be that the new CVE or the new IOC came out today, and now I'm going to look back at my old data and say, oh no, I was hit. We were touched by this. Let's apply that filter and discover everything that it touched and all the movement that occurred, and complete with user identity, all the things that you need to pull in to really have a clear and concise picture of what the actual event was, beyond just the initial we saw a breach, and that's it. This is all we know right now is we saw a breach.
Yeah. And if you're sophisticated enough, you might, even if you have that treasure trove of data, you can do the retrospective analysis, but you might even flip that on its head and say, I want to do threat hunting, right? I might want to come up with a hypothesis and just kind of scour through my data and see if I can validate one or disprove one of these hypotheses. And that serves two benefits. One, you actually now understand your environment and your network better. But B, it also lets you go after, approach your environment as an attacker would and actually answer some of these questions that you have.
Yeah, and that's a great point that brings up a thought. One of the things that people don't necessarily think about in terms of this sort of technology in the space is application dependencies that may be unknown, and because all you have is the developer's word on it, there's no backdoor. There's no other way to get in here, and it only requires a conversation with this server. I'm seeing this application talk all over my network. So is that good, bad, or indifferent? What does that traffic pattern look like? Is this supposed to be happening? It gives you information to go back to that developer or the application owner and say, why is this happening? Is this supposed to be here? If so, then I need to be aware of this. If not, then great, you know.
Yeah, and one kind of last thought on this kind of various sources of data is a lot of folks often ask, right, what's the most important source of data? What's that one thing that I should have? And the answer to that is, you know, you need it in layers, right? You call it defense in depth or defense in layers or whatever, but you need, you know, various different kinds of data that looks at your environment from different points of view and different vantage points, so that if any one of them is compromised, you have other source of data that you can rely on, right? So a great example to this is the SolarWinds attack, where you know, for folks that were primarily relying on EDR agents, one of the first thing that the attacker did in that environment is find the EDR agents and come up with strategies to evade them, disable them, or evade them, right? So immediately it, you know, your EDR agents, which is probably one of the key sources of data in these environments, are now not useful anymore, right? So now you're kind of scrambling for, all right, where else might I have seen this kind of activity? And that's where having, and typically we say in a SOC sort of tool set, you have a triad of, you know, your SIM is kind of where all the data goes in, and you have NDR and EDR. NDR, or network analytics, gives you kind of that breadth of visibility, the honest source of truth by looking at network traffic, so you can kind of get a bird's eye view. And EDR data is kind of deep dive into, you know, when you see something in a particular workload or server, you can deep dive into it and kind of zoom in, zoom out with EDR and NDR data. Right? So that's kind of how I think about it. And that's the kind of approach you need in the cloud, right? You need EDR, you need NDR, you need your activity logs, you need to be looking at identity and so on as well.
Yeah, it's literally everything. You know, what other tool out there can give you a view into everything? And you know, the passive view is in my mind very important, because you're not possibly changing or obfuscating data because perhaps I'm looking from a proxy point of view. So I have inherently changed my data because I proxied my data. So, but now with the network-centric view, regardless of where that network is, wherever that sensor is, I have a clear understanding of what this data looks like and how it's traversing, what its behaviors are, which kind of ties into how NDR can help, oddly enough, you know, with the slide up there.
That sounds like a great next topic for us.
Sounds fantastic. Yeah. So it's really, I cannot stress enough that, you know, visibility is really the key to everything else. Great, you're going to orchestrate. So what are your playbooks based off of? You know, how are you going to apply this information? So I've got all this information. What am I going to do with it? So, okay, well, here's my response. This is what I'm going to do. But it's based on all these other sources of data, the telemetry, the user, the log files, the traffic just going across, generally speaking. How much of this looks strange because it had a weird handshake when it did the encrypted handshake? You know, what does that look like, and why is it coming from this source or this going to this destination? All these things fall into line when you're really trying to have a clear understanding of what's happening overall on the network. Without this information, you can have all the endpoint stuff you want in the whole wide world, unless you have an understanding of how it's traversing the network and what it's interacting with. You are really just kind of left with a small piece of information that, sure, it's actionable. You know, I see a beacon coming from an endpoint, shut the endpoint down, great. You know, but beyond that, you know, you're kind of, what else is it touching? Where else is it going? You're not 100% certain without viewing that information.
So I might flip the question to you once again, Heath, a little bit. Maybe for folks on the call who are not aware of NAV or NDR, maybe you can just give them some context on, you know, what does the universe of NAV mean? And I obviously have a point of view and some perhaps biased point of view, but you probably have like a more, you know, industry wide point of view.
Right. So what network analysis and visibility is supposed to be is, it is a passive instrument sitting on the network. You're sitting on a span port, you're sitting on a tap, or there's a sensor in a cloud or close to some other segment that you're trying to monitor for a very specific reason, right? The idea is that it's going to collect all the data. It's going to look for malicious intent. be that from a user perspective, an application perspective, or straight malware. Are you doing MITRE attack frameworks and mapping it to them? Are you pulling down virus total information and trying to make sure that nothing that matches a pattern is happening on there? And then you're layering artificial intelligence and machine learning on top of that. So for the things that would take a human person a very long time to go through, you're being provided with this information up front. And not only is it actionable because it generated an alert, it sent an alert to the SIM, it sent an alert to the SOC team, but perhaps it's also tied to a source. So if I see this very specific network segment go crazy, down to the server level, I'm doing microsegmentation, controlling access, I see something baking off, well, I can provide that context, that information to an automated response and orchestration engine and say, this needs to be shut down right now. We don't have time to wait for a human, or this is a very important server. If we use this contextual information to shut the server down, there's going to be an impact on the business or on operations. So that's really the big thing. The R in response, I struggle with that because by default, this industry is supposed to be passive. This technology is passive. Now, providing that information to the actionable, the enforcement points is absolutely imperative. But just having an understanding that I'm not here to make changes to your network. I'm not going to take your core router down because I saw an infection.
Right. Yeah, I think the explanation I've heard for that R that has resonated with me is it's not only automated response, but human response as well, right? So there are some cases where you might use a small number of cases where you might use automated response, but more than likely it's a human response to a alert and actionable insight. Yeah, I thought that was kind of great sort of view of what NAV or NDR looks like, and I kind of wanted you to start with it because
yours is a different, yeah.
It's really the way I think about it, in the security community for the last 25 years, open source Zeek, formerly known as Bro, but Zeek today has been kind of, has evolved into the de facto standard for what you might use for network analysis, right? So it works exactly the same way as he described, which is it sits passively in your environment, consumes network traffic, and uses that network traffic, that bidirectional network traffic, to get a understanding of what in your environment, who are the entities in your environment talking out to, other entities outside, and it kind of gives you this kind of nice, set of data, which is, it's, you can call it data, you can call it logs, but I really think of it as it tells you a story about what's going on in your environment, right? This user came in, did such and such thing, logged in to such and such service over such and such, using such and such authentication, and then accessed or access such and such service for such and such duration and transferred such and such data in this direction, right? Now, you have all of that kind of consolidated view that a defender can easily look at. There are a couple of open source tools that have been popular for this over time. Suricata Suricata or Snort are pretty popular. Those are signature-based IDS tools. They're really focused on creating a pattern, like looking at a pattern on top of network traffic and generating an alert based off of that pattern. And Zeek really focused on generating data based on which you can have behavior-based detections, heuristics-based detection, or anomaly-based detection on top of that data as well, right? So with combination of these two tools kind of gives you a pretty good coverage of A, finding bad things that are happening in the network, and B, having the data. When you see some bad things happen, you have the data in hand to be able to investigate that bad thing, that alert as well.
Yeah, no, that's a great breakdown. I liked all the such and suches. They were my favorite part because it really that kind of illustrates a point, which is there's so much information that can be gleaned from this traffic. Such and such is a great way to say it because it may be from 15 different data points that you're creating this correlation from, and you're provided with some very exact, very concise information that you can say, I'm a level 1 SOC operator. I receive this notification through my CRM, you know, whatever. Here we go. Click the button. It goes off to the level 2 guy. And this person makes the determination whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, whether it needs escalation or not. But they have all that information there, contextually based, and it's there. It's an easy button. And I don't like to use that term overly much, but really you're making their jobs easier by providing them all the information instead of having, you know, the old days 15 years ago, digging back through, you know, reams, you know, well, megabytes at the time, but, you know, a lot of information really to try and discover what happened and why, and drawing these parallels yourself. These days, you don't have to do that anymore. It's all there for you. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, you know, a good example is what we do with there's been a suite of sort of open source tools out there, and we've done some work on top of that to generate sort of better insights from encrypted traffic, for example. So, you know, one example of that such and such is, you know, with an SSH session, we can do things like find out what kind of certs are you exchanging? You know, what is the validity of some of these certs in an SSL you know, session. In an SSH session, we can figure out, is this an interactive session? Is some person typing on a keyboard? What kind of keyboard is it? Like what you know, is it a Cyrillic keyboard or an English keyboard? We can figure out, is there a file upload download activity going on? Is there something that looks like a brute force attempt going on? Was MFA used or not? Was kind of handshake exchanged or not? So there are like so many of these kind of you know, intimate details about even an encrypted session that we can tease out just by looking at the raw network packet. Like we look at the packet, we look at the timing between the packets and how they exchange. We look at the you know, different kind of applications interact with these SSL sessions differently, and we can uniquely fingerprint, you know, what application you're communicating to on the other end over this SSL session, right? So that's the kind of like granular data that you can get, you know, using some of these open source tools that are, you know, embedded in, which, you know, becomes a pretty treasure trove of data when you're either investigating something bad that happened, or if you're writing analytics on top of that, right? So an example of an alert could be, you know, interactive sessions are okay only for you know, anything coming from a admin console IP, right? Any other IP address that has an interactive session, flag that right away, right? So something like that, you know, is pretty powerful, for example. So that's how you can write analytics on top of that.
Yeah, and to even stretch that out, you know, ETM is near and dear to my heart from some prior conversations, but very near and dear to my heart. But another really good aspect, I know we've been kind of focused on cloud here, but you know, IoT, OT, and IIoT are really kind of things that they're hard to manage in and of themselves. They're typically adjusted to some standard from a specific vendor for this very specific job. But having you know, they've become a really popular data exfiltration point because that traffic is always flowing. So, you know, having an understanding of what that's talking to and why, and if that deviates from the norm, the packets may be shaped the same every time. I'm going the wrong way, my mirror is reversed. But as this traffic is moving across the network, we know what the life of this traffic is supposed to look like through observational, through baselining. We have an understanding of what this is supposed to do. So starting to see something outside of the norm within that environment is hugely impactful, especially for somebody working in industry where that IoT or OT device may be out in the field somewhere. It could be a drone, it could be on a tractor, and now all of a sudden we're receiving data that's going out to some other, you know, location that it's never gone before, but the packets look okay, but it's going somewhere it's never gone before. That is definitely behavior that falls outside of the norm. And you know, if you're not in, you know, production or manufacturing, maybe you don't think about that. But if your office has HVAC controls that are connected to the wireless network, that's absolutely a concern. You know, they're doing remote monitoring of those things. So what do you do about those? Well, you apply this technology.
Right. Yeah, and I heard a great presenter speak a couple of weeks ago in our company offsite, where he said, if you think, you know, any enterprise out there, if you think you're not an IoT company, you're wrong, because you have IoT. You know, so everybody should be concerned about it. And kind of to bring this to full circle, right? We started about cloud and IoT. Interestingly enough, Amazon, the company Amazon, contributed a bunch of protocol parsers, and CISA has built on top of that. So now there's a bunch of protocol parsers that run on top of open source Zeek that can parse, IoT kind of traffic in a environment and extract this kind of metadata, which is precisely, what you're saying, Heath, is you can use that metadata to kind of baseline, and especially in a typical IoT environment, the baseline is pretty static, right? Things don't change that much. The things that, beacon a certain way, they interact with each other a certain way, the volume of traffic exchange is pretty standard. So it's a lot more standard, the volume of traffic is a lot lower, but it's way easier to detect sort of any deviations from the norm. And that's precisely what some of these folks are using these additional protocol parsers for in the IoT environments.
Yeah, that deviation from a norm is where it stands out. Even if it's made to look normal, that small change, the nefarious actors are very, very smart in how they're applying this, and how they're, injecting this data, especially in, unregulated things like maybe it's a Honeywell, maybe it's a GE, whatever that thing is on the wall. I really only need access to one brand, and then, maybe that's the leading brand, maybe that's some smaller brand that's only used in biotech or engineering or something like that, but now I have a backdoor into an organization that I may not have access to due to their robust security controls, and I may have access to that now, and maybe I can get some data out, but this technology space in general is supposed to catch that, and by doing exactly that, the observational techniques, passively observing and determining what's good, bad, and indifferent.
Yep. The one other point that I'll also make for a cloud environment now, as a lot of these tools have been used traditionally in on-prem environments, and if you think of our IoT and on-prem environments, the environments are typically largely static, right? Like you don't have as many ephemeral stuff going on. If you have a server running a certain application or service, it's kind of going to stay the same for a long period of time. Unlike in the cloud, where you'll have EC2 instances and containers come up and down in a matter of seconds, right? So these open source tools, the traditional kind of network monitoring tools, have always been indexed on IP address, and that notion kind of disappears as you kind of move out, right? So one of the things that we are looking into, and a lot of our customers are looking into, is it's not enough to start indexing these on IP addresses anymore. You need to start adding, other context to your NDR data, to your network-centric data, right? So imagine running in a cloud environment. If you can add context around the specific EC2 instance, if you can add context around the container, the pod name, the pod service, etc., all that application context, if you can add directly into the network data, now you're suddenly bridging, a large divide between, NDR used to be its own island, and EDR used to be its own island, and applications its own island. But as soon as you can add that data into any one of your logging systems, now you can suddenly bridge that gap. You can go from your network to your application logs very easily, because you have that context that you can use it to correlate with. Two, even with the network logs, you can ask very interesting questions, right? So you can look at your network logs or Zeek logs and ask questions about applications, right? What did this EC2 instance, or what did this service access? What security groups were applied to this particular EC2 instance? What security groups allowed access to this, domain outside my enterprise, et cetera, right? So it allows you to ask very kind of involved questions from your network data once you have that additional context and correlation to play with.
Yeah, that's a fantastic explanation. You're doing a great job. Yeah, that's really just a kind of, excuse me, kind of pile onto that, even from, you were talking about, essentially using, step-up auth or just-in-time access to perhaps spin up a new container that perhaps points somewhere else. Well, if you don't know, maybe they have your nomenclature down pat. They're spinning it up using your exact nomenclature, and maybe perhaps it's an insider that has an understanding that something like this is going to happen soon, so it wouldn't be viewed as out of the norm just to do a quick spin up of something, do a data dump in it, and then it's going to spin down because it is elastic. You know, we don't need this anymore. We reduce the size, now it's gone. Well, maybe that would have slipped by before. But if you're actually observing that traffic and applying all that additional context around that user, was there MFA involved? You know, where did that endpoint that started this transaction reside? Is it within our network? Is it external too? Is it somebody working from home, or is it somebody working on-prem? You know, all this information helps you make a clearer decision about, you know, do we ring the alarm bell and take immediate action, or do we have an understanding that this is supposed to happen, and then we can say, hey, this is okay, but still be aware of that for future use and future reference. This may happen on occasion, but perhaps we say it happens all the time. Perhaps it's just some of the time, or none of the time for that matter.
So now, with all this in mind, and the cybersecurity skill gap shortage that we're seeing, I know that's top of mind for a lot of our organizations that we work with. Heath, let's start with you. How do we work to help upskill our security operation teams, and what are some scalable strategies for success?
Oh, this is one of my favorite topics. Forrester has put out a lot of research lately around analyst experience, user experience, and employee experience, as well as customer experience. So one of the things that's become really hard these days is talent retention. You know, the old days, if you landed a job, that's what you did, man. You ran through that, and I have stability. Why would I go anywhere else? Well, today, there's not exactly a glut of qualified professionals on the market. So quite often it comes about that somebody gets a job with a company. You know, I'm going to work in the NOC, or I'm going to work in the SOC, and I'm going to really, this is the job that gets me to my next job. This is my experience. This is my resume builder. And so a lot of organizations, you know, worldwide, not just government, not just private industry, everyone is kind of experiencing the same issues. So how are you going to make your employees, your professionals, want to stay? Well, one of the ways that you can do it is providing not only that on-the-job training, but opportunities to expand your portfolio. I like to think of security professionals in one of two ways. You have a networking background, or you have perhaps a developing or programming background. Sometimes they play very well together, sometimes they don't. Some of the best security folks I know came from network operations centers, because they had a clear understanding of what the packet looks like crossing the network, what these IP addresses mean, what these schemas mean, what the network topology means, and they do very well. On the other hand, I've seen people come, you know, straight out of college with, you know, their computer science degrees, and have a clearer understanding of why these applications are interacting the way they are and what this means from a security perspective. Where you start to run into the silos, and everybody hates when I say silos. I said this the other day. Everybody hates when I say silos, but realistically, when you're developing a zero trust strategy for your organization, and regardless of, in the nav space is a great example, because the network operations team sets this up and maintains it. The security operations teams consumes all the information. It's a great opportunity to bridge between those two teams and provide the ability for cross-training. You know, you understand what this means from a network perspective, this is what it means for security, and vice versa. And that empowers your employees to really feel like they're gaining something insightful, gaining additional knowledge, and that's going to help with retention overall. You know, you don't want to lose good people. Nobody wants to lose good people, but sometimes it's inevitable. But here's a really good step that you can take to upskill and empower your employee organizations, be they NOC, SOC, you know, I'll stretch this into app dev and DevSecOps and enterprise. I'll stretch this everywhere, because it really applies across the board.
Yeah, I mean, I don't envy these folks at all, right? Because it's the pace at which our industry is evolving. It's kind of crazy that the technologies that, you know, I learned like 2-3 years ago are, I wouldn't say irrelevant, but, you know, in depreciating demand right now. So it is, A, that's a challenge. B, everybody is sort of overwhelmed with, like we were talking about, the volume of logs, volume of alerts, the volume of diversity in your environment. You have people bringing on all kinds of devices, and your software team is going on using all kinds of open source tools out from GitHub that has who knows what in it. So kind of the diversity of challenge that the SOC teams face is kind of insane. I totally agree with Heath that I think these opportunities where you can bridge the gap between the NOC and SOC teams allows you to kind of lean on the skill that you have, leverage that, and B, kind of learn a new skill as you go forward, right? So as you come from the NOC team, you can lean on your network skills, but you can learn security skills as you kind of grow in that role. The two things that I've seen folks find quite effective kind of in their career progression is leaning on community. There are a lot of really good communities out there that help people develop themselves professionally and personally in this regard. And security industry in general is really good about sort of fostering these kind of communities. So I've been to several B-sides kind of conferences in the past, a lot of sort of very user-centric security conferences that have been really great. A lot of the large security conferences have the capture the flag kind of events, which is a great way for you to get some hands-on training as well. And there's a lot of open source community in addition to Zeek and Suricata out there as well that you can lean on as you learn some of these new technologies. Community is one. The other thing I would say is kind of trying to get as much hands-on skill training as possible, right? It's one thing to learn a lot of these things in the vacuum, but trying to get your hands on some of these actual technologies so that you can try it out. Try it out in your corporate environment, try it out at home, try it out in a class that you're learning. That's irreplaceable as well.
Yeah, and it goes back to the old saying, necessity drives innovation. So you're bringing a different skill set to the table when you're kind of crossing the silos, crossing the pillars. You're bringing, perhaps you've been in the industry for 20 some odd years, and here's something that I saw 20 years ago, but has reared its ugly head again, but people forgot about. Maybe, yeah, it's part of an old IOC or an old CV, but maybe it's something that also, just hasn't been seen in the wild for 20 years. And so we're going to circle back and try this again. Nobody's looking for this anymore, that kind of thing. So yeah, it really is. It creates huge opportunities all the way around. It's not just for the employer or the employee, but it's for the industry as a whole.
Yeah, that's actually a very good point. A lot of the first principles that you have learned kind of back in the day, they still apply, right? You'll continue seeing alphabet soups of new technologies, but fundamentally it's still about like securing your environment. Is about like locking the doors and windows and continuously sort of monitoring that kind of stuff, right? Like those kind of first principles never go away. So yeah, definitely lean on those too.
Oh yeah, good point.
Well, thank you. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Vijay.
No, go. I was going to say on to you, Sarah.
Well, thank you, guys. That was certainly, incredibly helpful, and wanted to remind all of our attendees that this webinar is being recorded, and we will have this available on demand as well. Heath, Vijay, any closing statements before we wrap up for today? Anything to leave our attendees with?
No, I feel like we covered a lot of ground today. I mean, we started kind of in the zero trust space, but we talked about kind of cloud and how network and EDR kind of all blend together in this world. So yeah, I think it was a fun, interesting conversation. The kind of opportunity and what we have to do in this space kind of fills me with dread and anxiety, and at the same time a sense of opportunity, right? There is it's scary to see how vulnerable we as a community and we as a people are, right? Be it a critical infrastructure, be it some of the largest organizations are to some of these new technologies. But it also gives me a sense of the possibility and sense of opportunity for what we can do and what we can achieve. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that journey.
Yeah, and my wrapping is pretty simple. You know, I wear my tinfoil hat very tightly. I've been in security for a very long time, and every time I see an advance in this space, it fills me with hope, not dread. But I am quite aware of what the folks out there are doing to try and beat us. You know, so I mean, it skill honing and really getting in there and having a clear understanding. These are the things that are going to empower you on your journey moving forward.
Wonderful. Well, Keith, Vijit, thank you so much for joining us today. And to all of our attendees, we look forward to seeing you on another Corelight Cloud Security webinar. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too. Bye, guys.
Bye.